My name is Mike Clancy, and this is the introduction to my seven-part lecture series on Project AZORIAN, the CIA's attempt to covertly recover a Soviet submarine from the floor of the Pacific Ocean. In this video, we will cover the organization of the lecture series and a list of my sources. But first, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my background and how I got interested in Project AZORIAN. I'm a retired Navy civilian scientist specializing in meteorology, oceanography, and information technology. Although I worked for the Naval Research Lab for 4 years in the late 70s and early 80s, I spent most of my 32 years as a Navy civilian scientist at the Fleet Numerical Meteorology and Oceanography Center in Monterey, where I served as technical and scientific director from 2005 to 2011. As you will see in part 6 of this lecture series, Fleet Numerical played a key role in Project AZORIAN. For a couple of years in the late 2000s, the Navy's Integrated Undersea Surveillance System, IUSS, became part of the Naval Meteorology and Oceanography Command. As a result, I was peripherally and briefly involved with the Navy's undersea surveillance capabilities, which were crucial for locating the sunken Soviet submarine and enabling Project AZORIAN. And I first became aware of the Howard Hughes seafloor mining story as an oceanography undergraduate student in 1973 and became fascinated with Project AZORIAN when it was revealed in 1975 that this was just a cover story for the CIA's attempt to covertly raise a Soviet submarine from the bottom of the ocean. I began giving lectures on Project AZORIAN all over the Monterey Bay area in early 2024, with this YouTube channel giving basically an extended version of those lectures. And by the way, I've put an extended version of my bio in the comments section of this channel if you want to learn more about me and my background. So here's the organization of the seven-part lecture series. In part one, we'll talk about historical context, the submarine and its mission, the U.S. search for the submarine, the beginnings of Project AZORIAN, the cover story, and Howard Hughes. In part two, we'll talk about the Glomar 2 mission, final preparations for the recovery operation, and we'll ask the question, what did the Soviets know? In part three, we will devote the entire effort to the details of the recovery operation, which is really the most exciting part of this whole story. In part four, we'll talk about the take, in other words, what was recovered and where it went. We'll talk about the follow-on attempt to raise the submarine. We'll talk about how the story breaks, and I'll raise a final question. That final question is, was it worth it? In part five, I'm going to talk in some detail about what caused the K-129 to sink. It's pretty well understood, thanks to the book by Palmar and White, which came out in 2010, that two of the missiles aboard the submarine fired mistakenly in a missile launch drill, and that was basically what caused the submarine to go down. But Palmar and White stopped short of identifying the root cause of that accident, and I'm very confident I know the root cause of that. That's my one original contribution to this story, and we'll be digging into that in part five. In part six, I'm going to be talking about connections to Monterey. The general public may not be that interested in this part. People who live in the Monterey Bay area probably are. Indeed, that was a big part of the talks I've been giving the last couple of years. So I'll talk in some detail about that. And there's a lot of good, interesting information in that. And finally, in part seven, I'll talk about sort of an epilogue. I'll talk about the fate of the Glomar Explorer, the fate of the HMB-1, the barge that was a big part of this story, the fate of the capture vehicle and the pipe string used in the recovery operation. I'll talk about the Glomar response. And I'd like to close by giving a tribute to the crew of the K-129. They were our enemies, of course. They were prepared to do great harm against our nation, as were our sailors against their nation. But they were very brave men, and you had to be brave to sail on one of those submarines back then. And we'll talk a little bit about and pay tribute to the crew of the K-129 at the very end. I want to talk now about my sources. There's probably been about a dozen or so books written about Project AZORIAN over the years. I've read most of them. These are the ones I recommend the most. There are a number not on this list I don't recommend, but these are the ones I recommend the most. The first one is very notable just for historical purposes and a matter of risk. This is the very first book that came out on the story. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation in this book, but nevertheless, it is a remarkable book. It was the first to tell the story in great detail. And it provides a really interesting viewpoint into the whole operation. I highly recommend this book. I'm pretty sure it's still in print. Spy Sub was all about the Halibut, special operations submarine that played a key role in localizing the K-129 submarine. Blind Man's Bluff by Sherry Sontag and Christopher Drew is a really great book about the submarine operations that took place during the Cold War. Project Azorian being one chapter in this book, and it's very well done. The Silent War by John Craven is definitely worth a read. John Craven was the head of the Navy's Special Projects Office. He's the guy who set up the submarine Halibut to be able to do amazing things talked about in Blind Man's Bluff, including playing a role in Project Azorian. He also raises a scenario which I like to call the Hunt for Red October scenario as to what caused the submarine to go down. We'll talk about that later on. This is a declassified CIA report I highly recommend. The CIA kind of slipped up in the 2000s and made it known that they were actually involved in Project Azorian. Before that, they'd been denying it or hadn't been responding to it. So because they had done that, that opened them up to a Freedom of Information Act query, and that query was filed, and this is the resulting report. It's essentially the CIA's in-house history of Project Azorian. It's highly redacted. It's awkward to read because it's so highly redacted, but it's still interesting. You're getting it directly from the horse's mouth. Most of the most exciting parts, the most important parts associated with the recovery operation is all redacted out. The parts that aren't redacted are kind of things that aren't that relevant to the recovery operation and so forth, but they're still interesting to read. There was a lot of twists and turns in this story, a lot of, in some cases, humorous episodes that took place over the course of this project, and you get a really good window into that by looking at the declassified CIA reports. It's easy to find. Just Google CIA report Glomar Explorer, and you'll find it out there. It's been out there for quite a few years. I think it was declassified in 2010, and you can download it as a PDF document and have a look at it. This book by Palmar and White made a huge contribution to this whole story by identifying the failed missile drill as being what caused the casualty aboard the submarine that sent it down. And I'm very, very confident they got that part right. It was a failure of the fire control system that controlled the launching of the missiles during a missile launch drill that caused the submarine to go down. But as I mentioned, Palmer and White stopped short of identifying the root cause of that fire control mishap, and I think I know the answer to that. I'm going to talk about it in some detail. These last two books are the best two books. If you only read two books about this project, I recommend these last two. David Sharp was the lead CIA engineer aboard the Glomar Explorer, responsible for the heavy lift operation. And he's a great writer. The book is extremely well written. And if you're interested in the engineering aspects of the story and the details of the recovery operation, this is the book for you. It is really, really excellent. And I strongly recommend it. If you're looking for a bigger, a wider perspective, sort of the bigger picture, including sort of the geopolitical implications, then I strongly recommend this book by Josh Dean, The Taking of the K-129. Both Sharp and Dean are fantastic writers, and the books are very well done. So I strongly recommend those two books. And finally, I've got to know and interview three principals in the project. The first being Joe Houston. He was the chief optical engineer for Project Azorian. He's mentioned prominently in the book Taking of the K-129 by Josh Dean. The underwater camera and lighting gear he designed was crucial to the success of the mission. It was deployed on the Glomar 2 mission, which took place in 1970, prerequisite for the recovery operation. If it hadn't been for Joe's brilliant engineering of developing this camera gear and lighting system, the project would have not succeeded because it turns out they had underestimated the size and the weight of the submarine, and this allowed the engineers to do the things they had to do. They actually had to redesign the Glomar. They had to make it wider, so wide that it couldn't fit through the Panama Canal. They had to redesign the steel used or use different type of steel in the capture vehicle because they had underestimated the weight of the submarine. So Joe's contributions were enormous. He was an employee of a company called iTech, worked on many CIA projects over the years. This gentleman here, Chief Cryptologic Technician Interpretive, CTIC, James N. Reed, U.S. Navy. Picture is as he appeared when he served aboard the Glomar Explorer. He was a linguist, intelligence officer and linguist trained at the Defense Language Institute, a Russian linguist, trained at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey. That's how I got to know Jim. Personnel at DLI referred me to him. Sadly, I have to tell you, he passed away last summer. He lived on the East Coast. We talked on the phone a couple of times, and he famously spoke the Russian language portion of the eulogy during the burial at sea ceremony for the human remains recovered from the submarine. You can see that whole burial at sea operation on YouTube by Googling burial at sea Glomar Explorer. When you hear the Russian part, it is Jim Riggs speaking that part. Wonderful story he told me about when he and his family went to Russia many years later, went to St. Petersburg, met up with a club there of retired submariners. They welcomed with open arms, and he told the story, and I'm going to tell that story to you later on. And finally, this gentleman here, Ray Feldman. Ray was a Lockheed engineer who served aboard the Glomar Explorer. He was part of the A crew. There was an A crew and a B crew. The A crew were the people who were actually at the wreck site recovering the submarine. Ray was part of that. The B crew was the part that came on after that and was responsible for exploiting the intelligence aboard the submarine. Ray was a Lockheed engineer who served aboard the Glomar Explorer during the recovery operation, and he was responsible for the communications link between the ship and the capture vehicle. There was this cable that went down all the way to the bottom, over 3.5 miles, and the communications between the ship and the capture vehicle were through that cable. All the operations of the hydraulics and electronics and so forth that enabled the capture vehicle to grab a hold of the submarine that came up through that cable, which Ray designed and was responsible for. So he had a huge responsibility aboard the Glomar Explorer, and I've really enjoyed getting to know him and talking with him. This is Mike Clancy. Thank you for watching, and I hope you will enjoy this lecture series.